مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بالنسبة للحزب الجمهوري يجب أن تكون الشمبانيا مثلجة استعدادا للاحتفال بعد انتخابات نوفمبر. فتاريخيا تنجح المعارضة غالبا في الانتخابات التشريعية في منتصف ولاية الرئيس الجديد، وبسبب مشاكل السنتين الأوائل للرئيس بايدن كالتضخم المرتفع وانسحاب من أفغانستان، فيبدو أن التاريخ سيعيد نفسه. إلا أن الجمهوريين لم يبدؤوا الاحتفال بعد، وبالرغم من أن التوقعات تشير إلى الحزب الجمهوري سيخضع بالقيادة الكونغرس ومجلس الشيوخ معا، إلا أن الخبراء يعتقدون أن المنافسة للسيطرة على المجلسين ستكون شديدة. ماذا حصل؟ لماذا يشعر الجمهوريون بالقلق من عدم فوزهم بمجلس الكونغرس أو بمجلس الشيوخ؟ ما الدور الذي لعبه دونالد ترامب؟ هل هو عنصر قوة أم مشكلة بالنسبة للمرشحين عبر البلاد؟ للمناقشة وعد الحزب الجمهوري قبل شهر من الانتخاباتنا التشريعية، يسرني أن أستضيف اثنين من الصحفيين الأكثر معرفة في هذا الشأن في واشنطن، جيم أنتل وأليكس ايزنستاد. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Happy days are here again. That's historically a Democratic theme song, but Republicans were humming it until recently, when their fortunes seem to have taken a turn for their worse. Why aren't Republicans nearly as excited today about the November election as they were just 2, 3, 5 months ago? I'm delighted to have Jim Antle and Alex Eisenstadt with me to dissect these questions and help explain Republican fortunes as we approach our November election. So, Jim, let me start with you. Big picture, why are many Republicans less enthusiastic and hopeful today about their November prospects than they were just not too long ago?
Well, there are a few things. I think one is that at the summertime, earlier in the summer, it looked like the midterm elections could be waged as a straight referendum on President Joe Biden and his performance in office, which a majority of Americans don't think is very good. And at that time, it was a larger majority of Americans than today, at least according to most polls. But still, even at the moment, a majority of Americans disapprove of how the president has performed in office. And so that was a pretty good environment in which for Republicans to run in. But now there have been some other issues that kind of make it a little bit more of a choice and less of a referendum. So there are some things that Democrats can point to as sort of counter arguments as to why you should vote for them, as opposed to simply doing a thumb up or thumbs down for the president. So the first of those was the Supreme Court overturning Roe versus Wade, which made abortion an issue in some states and districts where it otherwise would not have been a major issue. And some of that is coming to the detriment of Republicans. Secondly, the reemergence of former President Donald Trump, both by choice, because he's been very active on the campaign trail and in the Republican primaries, and sort of not by choice in the sense that he's got a wide range of legal issues, the most significant being the FBI raid on his home in Mar-A-Lago, the Mar-A-Lago estate in Florida, has sort of brought Trump back, which has helped President Biden put Trump on the ballot in races where he wasn't really going to be on the ballot. And then thirdly, the slate of Senate candidates Republicans have nominated, some of them have not performed very well in the battleground states. So those things combined have sort of deflated the Republicans just a little bit.
So let me ask Alex about one item that Jim didn't mention. Normally, we hear from experts that by far and away the top issue in these elections is usually the economy, and the economy is not doing great. We have high and persistently high inflation. But that does not seem to be worsening prospects for the governing party. Instead, we have these other issues that are nibbling away at the edges. Alex, is economics not still number one?
Well, I would say that economics is an important issue, and look, Republicans are still favored to win the House. They still have a pretty decent chance of winning the Senate. It's a little unclear. So the economy is still a major factor in this election, but there are other issues that Republicans now, as the election grows closer, are starting to talk about as well. For example, education policy, for example, crime, immigration. Those are issues that you're seeing Republicans talk about as well as the election gets closer.
Then let's take a look at some of the items that Jim just referred to.
Sure.
First and foremost, Donald Trump. When you travel around the country, you talk to Republican candidates. His reemergence in the last several months, is this good or bad for local candidates in most places around the country? Alex, I'll start with you.
Well, it's a complicated question, right? Because on the one hand, he helps Republicans in terms of turning out their base, in terms of turning out his supporters, in terms of turning out conservatives. On the other hand, he is not terribly popular with a large portion of the electorate, including more moderate voters, people who live in the suburbs. And so a lot of those people are voters that Republican candidates really want to have turn out for them in November. And so it's this complicated calculus, right? Do you bring in President Trump because you need him to turn out your base, or do you not bring him out because he could alienate some of those other voters that you need to have turn out for you in the midterms?
And so, Jim, President Trump touted his endorsements in Republican primaries as being having what we would use the fable term, the Midas touch, namely that
Right.
If you endorsed somebody, chances were likely that they won. Those endorsed candidates, are they now sticking tightly with Donald Trump throughout the general election campaign?
Well, there's a huge variety in terms of what a Trump endorsement means. And one of the ways in which he sort of pads his stats in terms of his winning record is he does endorse a number of Republicans, many of them incumbents, people who are going to win regardless of whether Trump endorsed them or not. But there are also a subset of Trump endorsements where he really did play a big role in their winning their primaries. And many of them were wedded pretty tightly to him. And I think we see that particularly in the Senate races, where you have a number of Senate candidates who probably wouldn't have made it out of their primaries without Trump's help. Many of them were very closely tied to Trump during the primaries. Some of them remain so. Some of them are trying to pivot a little bit more to the general election. And so you have candidates like J.D. Vance in Ohio who are appearing regularly with Trump, where Trump won the state by 8 points in 2020. J.D. Vance would be very happy to win by 8 points. He's currently leading in most polls, but not by anywhere close to that margin. So it's a little bit of a more nerve-wracking race than others. But then there are some states where the Trump endorsement isn't quite as helpful. I think you see in some of the swing House districts, certainly the Colorado Senate race might be a tighter Senate race if Trump wasn't something we were talking about. A fairly Trump-aligned candidate has recently been nominated in New Hampshire. We'll have to see how much he continues to talk about Trump. He's already backed off his 2020 election denial. New Hampshire is not a very good state for being tied to Trump. So a lot of it really does depend on sort of the ground that you're trying to fight on. There are some places where Trump is an asset, some places where he's a liability. I think the big thing for Republicans is before a lot of the legal problems, they were going to be able to use him more selectively. Places where he was more of an asset, they could talk about him. Places where he wasn't, they wouldn't talk about him. Now they kind of have to talk about him to some extent everywhere.
And Alex, in recent months, one of the major national news stories was, of course, the raid on former President Trump's home in Mar-A-Lago in Florida, the discovery of classified material, which is now in the courts. This has, in some sense, fueled enthusiasm among Democrats and fueled some enthusiasm among Republicans. When you look at it in total, what is the net enthusiasm factor? Is this whole affair better off for Republicans or better off for Democrats?
Well, it's hard to tell, but there's an argument to be made that it's better off for Democrats because to the extent that the news is totally focused on Trump, it makes the election more about him as opposed to Democrats and Joe Biden. And typically in midterm elections, the party out of power gains seats by turning the election into a referendum on the party in power and the party that holds the White House. And so with this raid, it sort of took focus to some extent off of the White House and its struggles on a number of different issues, and it put that focus instead on former President Trump.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at a couple of key races around the country that may have national implications for the Republican Party, both in 2022 and even our presidential vote in 2024, in just a moment. Until recently, Republicans looked like they would sweep to a landslide victory in our November legislative elections. Now, with just weeks to go, the momentum has shifted. Who will win? No one knows. But from the earliest days of our republic, experts picked winners, some who won, some who lost. Here are three of the greatest upset victories in American political history. James Polk, a Democrat, was the largely unknown governor of Tennessee, taking on Henry Clay, a Whig politician, one of the best known and most powerful men in America. In the presidential election of 1844, no one gave Polk a chance, but he proved a surprisingly nimble, effective, and straight-talking speaker against the elitist Clay, and in the end, he squeaked out a narrow victory. A man of his word, James Polk campaigned on a promise that he would serve just one term, and that's what he did. Then there's Lisa Murkowski, a Republican. She was appointed to a seat in the U.S. Senate from Alaska after her father, the incumbent, died. Then she won re-election 4 years later. But then in 2010, she lost the Republican nomination to a much more conservative candidate. But instead of retiring, Murkowski ran a write-in campaign, which literally means voters had to write her name on the ballot to cast a vote for her. No simple feat when your name is Murkowski. Well, she won, only the second write-in victor in Senate history. And then the most famous upset of all, Harry Truman's election for president in 1948. Truman was an accidental president, taking office when Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. By 48, he was running for his own term in office and was expected to lose convincingly to the charismatic governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. The Chicago Tribune famously even ran a headline on the night of the election, "Dewey defeats Truman." But it was not to be. Thanks to a whistle-stop train tour that crisscrossed the nation, bringing him in front of a huge number of voters, Truman eked out a victory, the greatest upset in presidential history. Unless, of course, you count Donald Trump's victory in 2016, but that's another story. Again, welcome back to Dakhel Washington. My guests today include Alex Eisenstadt. Alex is national political reporter at Politico, an online news site here in our nation's capital that is all politics all the time. Also joining us is Jim Antle. Jim is the politics editor at the Washington Examiner. Previously, he was managing editor of the Daily Caller and senior writer for the American Conservative. Jim is the author of the book, Devouring Freedom: Can Big Government Ever Be Stopped? Actually, Jim, in the first segment, you referred to the Afghanistan withdrawal as the beginning of the downward slide for President Biden in national poll numbers, the big foreign policy story of 2021.
Right.
In 2022, the big foreign policy story is Ukraine.
Right.
And the near national consensus in terms of support for Ukraine, consensus
Right.
that is being nibbled away at the margins in some circles.
Mhm.
Has Ukraine sort of changed the foreign policy story regarding Joe Biden?
Even though there seems to be a broad consensus supportive roughly of what the Biden administration is doing on Ukraine, there is a subset of Republicans that have increasingly been speaking out against the aid and against what they think might end up getting us more deeply enmeshed in the war. But by and large, there's strong bipartisan support for what the president is doing. It doesn't seem to have moved his poll numbers on foreign policy generally very much. I think it's a difficult issue in the sense that, even though there's been a Ukrainian counteroffensive that does seem to be making progress, the whole thing does, I think, look from an American perspective to be a stalemate. And anything Biden could do that would get us more deeply involved would be controversial. Anything he doesn't do maintains it as a stalemate. So I think it's a little bit difficult for it to move Biden's numbers, even though I think most Americans are broadly sympathetic with what he's trying to do, which is to essentially raise the costs of the Russian invasion for Russia, deter it from doing these types of things in the future, incentivize them getting out. I think most Americans are broadly in alignment with Biden on those things, but it doesn't seem to have really had a major impact on his numbers.
So, Alex, let's take a look at some of the key elections. And I want to ask you in this sense, are there any elections, any of these Senate elections especially, or perhaps a governor's election, that are really stalking horses for the ultimate decision of Donald Trump whether to run for re-election? Elections that he has invested so much in that if he loses, if his man or woman loses, it's a huge blow to him. Or conversely, if his candidate wins, it really suggests that he has remarkable staying power and resilience and that he's ready for 2024.
Sure. So some of the races, Senate races that he's invested most heavily in include the Georgia Senate race where he's endorsed Herschel Walker, the Ohio Senate race where he's endorsed J.D. Vance, the Arizona Senate race where he's endorsed Blake Masters. And so these are a few of the races where you look at how he performs. If you look at how he ends up performing in these races, in these Senate races and others in November, people are going to take a close look at that win-loss record and they're going to say, well, if he didn't do well in these races, does that say something about how popular he is and whether he should be able to move forward with a 2024 run? Of course, we know that Trump really does kind of what he wants to do, right? It won't necessarily bother him if his candidates win or lose in the fall. But those are a few examples of races that he's invested in pretty heavily.
All right, when we only have a few seconds left, and I can't let this show end without me asking both of you for your November predictions. You knew this was coming. So Jim, let me begin with you. Given where we are today, what do you think the results, big picture, Democratic, Republican control of House and Senate come November?
I think Republicans take the House fairly easily, and the Senate could come down to another runoff election in Georgia.
Another runoff election, just what we need. All right,
Absolutely.
Alex.
Hard to say, but I think Republicans take the House. I think Democrats narrowly, either Democrats or Republicans narrowly win the Senate. How about that?
You're going out on the limb on that one, Alex. All right, gentlemen, terrific. Thank you very much for helping to explain the internal Republican dynamic as we begin the final leg of the campaign before our November congressional vote. Thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you.
I have sympathy for our viewers around the Middle East trying to keep track of the legal problems that have befallen our former president, Donald Trump, and whether any of this matters in both the sense of being historically relevant and whether it will have any impact on the president's political fortunes. After all, Trump is the ultimate Teflon leader. Nothing seems to stick. The third president to be impeached, he is the first ever to be impeached twice, and neither episode seems to have an impact on his hold over the Republican Party. Other scandals come and go, whether it's the Access Hollywood tape, the accusations of multiple improprieties with women, the Russia investigation, Trump hotel shenanigans, the various Trump Incorporated lawsuits. So far, that includes the inquiry into efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election results, as well as the congressional investigation into the violent January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. All this may change, of course. The commission may recommend criminal charges against Trump, and the attorney general may decide to pursue them. But so far, the former president has evaded them all. Indeed, what he once said, that he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and get away with it, seems accurate and almost prophetic. In this context comes the latest scandal, the Mar-A-Lago Papers. This one lacks the human drama of previous scandals. It certainly doesn't seem to be about sex, money, or violence. It's about documents. Of course, not just any documents, some of our nation's most closely guarded secrets about nuclear matters and the personal files of foreign leaders. But still, it's just paper. The real question is why? Why would President Trump transport boxes of classified files from the White House to his home in Palm Beach, Florida, keeping them in a locked closet, and then have his subordinates lie about having them in his possession, with lawyers telling U.S. government officials that they were only newspaper clippings? What was so compelling about these documents that it was worth violating federal law to keep them in his personal possession? As an historian, I revere documents. They are the record of our human achievements, our failings, our hopes, our fears, our misdeeds, and our accomplishments. Memories come and go, but contemporaneous documents are usually faithful reflections of at least what the person who wrote them at the time wanted to be remembered. That's why I hope we get to the bottom of the Mar-A-Lago Papers, to know why they mattered so much to President Trump. And if indeed he purposefully spirited out of the Oval Office all those papers in violation of federal law, these documents that belong to the people of the United States no less than does the Declaration of Independence, then I hope the legal system pursues justice. This case may not have the gravity of the January 6th insurrection, but as I hinted at the outset, it really does matter. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كان لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج وبالأخص بشأن دور دونالد ترامب المستمر في السياسة الوطنية، تواصلوا معي رجاء عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @RobSatloff. إلى اللقاء في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.